You're in the shower, arguing with someone who isn't there. You're winning. Obviously, you've delivered the perfect comeback. Twice, maybe 3 times. None of it happened. None of it will. Most people think this is anxiety. It isn't. Your brain is doing something far more interesting. This isn't a one-time thing either. You've done this in the car, while brushing your teeth, walking the dog. Some old conversation resurfaces, except this time you say the thing you didn't say. You win the argument you actually lost 3 years ago. The other person stands there, silent, exactly where you put them, while you deliver a closing statement they will never hear. If this only happened occasionally, you might write it off as a quirk. But it doesn't happen occasionally. It happens constantly, across nearly every culture researchers have studied, in people who otherwise show no signs of anxiety, rumination disorders, or anything resembling a problem. Which raises an obvious question. If it isn't anxiety, what is your brain actually doing in that shower? To answer that, you have to look at a part of psychology most people have never heard of, even though they engage in it almost daily. Researchers call it the imaginary interlocutor effect, and it shows up most clearly in what psychologists term internal dialogue, or the silent back-and-forth conversations your mind runs when no one else is in the room. For a long time, this kind of internal speech was assumed to be background noise, mental clutter, the brain idling. But psychologist Charles Fernyhough, who has spent years studying inner speech at Durham University, found something that didn't fit that assumption. When people engage in imagined arguments, especially ones involving a specific, familiar person, their brain activates almost the same regions used during real social interaction. Not a simplified version, not a daydream-adjacent flicker of activity, something close to the genuine social processing network running on a person who isn't there. That alone is strange enough to sit with for a second. Your brain isn't treating the imagined conversation as fake. It's treating it as practice. This is where the explanation starts to take shape, and it's not the explanation most people expect. Think about what an argument actually requires. You have to predict what the other person will say. You have to prepare a response. You have to anticipate their reaction to your response and adjust accordingly. This is an enormous amount of social computation, and your brain doesn't like doing all of that computation live, in real time, with real consequences if it can help it. So, it doesn't. Here's something researchers didn't expect to find when they started studying this more closely. The shower argument, the one you're definitely winning, isn't your brain reliving the past. It's your brain rehearsing the future, even when the conversation already happened, even when there's no scenario where you'll ever actually deliver that comeback. Your brain runs the simulation anyway, because simulation is the actual function. The content is almost beside the point. This is the moment that reframes the entire shower argument from something embarrassing into something almost impressive. You are not stuck in the past. You're using the past as raw material to train a system that has nothing to do with the past at all. If you've ever felt a little unhinged delivering a perfect comeback to an empty shower, you're not broken. You're running one of the most sophisticated simulations your brain is capable of producing. Social psychologists studying what's called social rehearsal have found that humans engage in this kind of imagined interaction across an enormous range of situations, not just conflict. People rehearse job interviews that haven't happened yet. They rehearse apologies. They rehearse asking someone out, telling someone they're moving away, explaining a decision to a parent. The conflict version simply feels more vivid because conflict carries higher emotional stakes, and your brain prioritizes rehearsing high-stakes situations over low-stakes ones. This is not a malfunction. This is a brain doing exactly what brains evolved to do with limited resources and an uncertain future. Here's something that complicates the story in an interesting way, though. If this were purely about future preparation, you would expect the rehearsal to stop once the real event was no longer possible. The argument from 3 years ago has no future version. There is no real-world payoff coming, and yet the rehearsal continues anyway, sometimes for years, triggered by nothing more specific than warm water and quiet. Researchers studying memory reconsolidation, the process by which memories are slightly altered each time they're recalled, suggests something that might explain this. Every time you imagine winning that old argument, you're not just rehearsing a future skill. You're also quietly editing the emotional weight of the original memory. The version where you said nothing gets gradually buffered by dozens of imagined versions where you said exactly the right thing. Over time, the emotional sting fades, not because the event changed, but because your brain has layered enough alternate outcomes on top of it that the original loses some of its grip. In other words, the shower argument may be doing two jobs at once: training a skill for situations that haven't happened yet, and slowly defusing a situation that already has. Think about what that means for something that, on the surface, looks like a strange private habit. You've probably never told anyone about your shower arguments, partly because they feel a little embarrassing to admit out loud. But this isn't an isolated quirk happening only in your head. It's a documented, near-universal feature of how human cognition processes both social skill building and emotional resolution, running quietly in the background of an activity as mundane as washing your hair. There's something worth noticing in how often this happens, specifically in moments of low external stimulation. The shower, the commute, the walk with no one to talk to. These are the exact conditions where your brain has spare processing capacity and nothing urgent demanding its attention. It's not a coincidence that imaginary arguments cluster in these quiet pockets. It's precisely when your brain has room to run the simulation that it always wanted to run. But there's a detail in the research that complicates this picture even further, and it's worth pausing on. Not everyone runs the same kind of imagined conversation. Some people rehearse calm, measured responses. Others, and this is far more common than you'd expect, rehearse versions of themselves that are sharper, faster, more cutting than they would ever actually be in person. Researchers studying this gap between imagined and actual social behavior have found that the imagined version isn't meant to be realistic. It's meant to be optimized. Your brain isn't simulating what you would say. It's simulating what you wish you had the nerve to say, stripped of hesitation, social cost, and the fear of how the other person might respond. This matters because it means the shower argument isn't really rehearsal for a real future conversation at all, at least not directly. It's something closer to a controlled space where you get to test the outer edge of your own assertiveness without any of the risk that usually keeps that edge in check. You get to find out what the boldest version of you sounds like, in a room with no witnesses and no consequences. Some psychologists studying assertiveness training have noted something practical that follows from this. People who regularly engage in this kind of imagined rehearsal, even informally, tend to access more confident language faster when a real confrontation does arise later, even on an unrelated topic. The specific argument rarely repeats itself exactly, but the muscle, the willingness to speak directly under pressure, appears to transfer. You weren't just refining a comeback, you were quietly practicing the feeling of not backing down. This reframes the whole habit one more time. It isn't really about the person you're arguing with at all, imagined or otherwise. It's about building familiarity with a version of yourself that doesn't flinch. The shower just happens to be where that version gets the most uninterrupted stage time. So the next time you catch yourself mid-comeback, arm half raised, delivering a flawless rebuttal to someone who has no idea this conversation is happening, you don't have to feel embarrassed by it. You're not failing to let go of the past. You're not spiraling. You're doing something your brain has been quietly doing for as long as humans have had social relationships worth getting right. You're in the shower, arguing with someone who isn't there. You're winning, obviously. And this time you know exactly what that means. It was never about winning the argument. It was about your brain making sure that next time, whatever next time turns out to be, you'll already know exactly what to say.